Good morning and welcome to this special IslandStats.com Sports Talk. I'm your host, Earl Basden. Joining me is the president of Trinidad and Tobago's Olympic, am I right? Olympic Committee.
Well, let me correct that. Good morning to you. Good morning to all your listeners. Good morning to my good friends in the Commonwealth and Olympic movement in Bermuda. Judy Simmons, Peter Dune, Branway, Ben, Katura, etc. I'm the immediate past president of the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee and the Trinidad and Tobago Commonwealth Games Association, having passed the baton, the first ever female president. Diane Henderson in April, May last year.
Yes.
And I'm also the former CANOC, Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees president. We had elections in November and last year. So I'm now the current Secretary General of CANOC. I was asked to support Keith Joseph, my very good friend's efforts to become the next president, and that I did. And so that more or less corrects it all. And I'm also which is really more, I would say, important, relevant to the conversation. I'm the chair of this a very important committee called the Gender, Race, Inclusion, and Diversity. It's a committee of an organization called the Sport Integrity Global Alliance, SIGA. So anyway, that's my mouthful, and good morning again.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's what we're going to be talking about. How important is it to...
I don't want anybody saying a false claim, not president.
How important is it to actually look at the past and also address what happened in the past to make sure that we can all move forward?
Well, again, the Marcus Garvey more or less said it very powerfully, and he said, I may be paraphrasing a bit, people who don't have knowledge of their history, culture, and origins, they are like a tree without roots. And, in particular here in the Caribbean, without exception, the reality of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is a brutal, inhumane reality. And while for different reasons, people tend to say, forget the past is past. The past is gone. And stop being stuck. Victimhood, all these nice things. As Bob Marley said, we are emancipated physically, or words to that effect. We decolonized physically, but we are very much still enslaved mentally, emotionally, and psychologically, and we are still colonized in our mind if we take that approach.
In sport, we know a lot of the past, and especially, you were one that talked a lot about after 50 years, the two athletes were finally given their due. But if we didn't look back and didn't bring that up, do you think they would have had the justice they had 50 years later?
Certainly not. Everybody was prepared, including the big United States of America, their Olympic Committee, and all these global athlete activist groups and commission. No, because these were two black athletes from America who, at the time, 1972, 1968, it was civil rights movements and Black Power and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. And as I said, for many people, that's the black people thing. What they're fussing for, But, and then there are those people, like a number of my Caribbean colleagues who believe that sport is sport, and sport people shouldn't be heard. They just play sports, administrate sports, manage sports, lead sports, and stay in that narrow confines, which also is part of the colonization. You know, white supremacy and white privilege, and the fact that the global Olympic and Commonwealth sport movement, it's a old white boys club going back. It's not just racism, it's sexism, gender. But most people, for some reason, are more comfortable talking about gender equality and gender equity, and we need, you know, like in my case, future is female. Everybody is very vocal. From the time, if I only dare say future is black and brown, it's a whole different vibe. Because people want to forget that atrocity. And it still impacts us, Earl.
Yeah.
It still impacts us because the system that is racist and systemizes racial discrimination goes back to the origins of the colonizers and the colonization and the oppressors and the brutality and inhumanity of slavery. And this is something I hope, you know, I thank you for the opportunity, Earl, to speak on it, especially, you know, I hope my colleagues in Bermuda are listening and watching, who will at some point in time. Just remind them that I wasn't trying to portray myself as the president of the TTOC and CANOC, so I hope you'll change that graphic at some point. It's a real important thing, you know, because even if you go back to my suggestion that reparation under the Commonwealth Games Federation should have a reparation fund, and use reparation payments or part thereof to support and assist the development of Commonwealth sports, in particular in the Caribbean. Some people have asked me, well, why in God's precious name you're going down that rabbit hole, boy? So they're careful with the use boy. You know, when we're talking in the frame between the elimination of racial discrimination, which was the 21st of March, and the International Day for the Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which is on Saturday, tomorrow, the 25th of March, which happens to be my birthday. You know, the United Nations, which can be very performative, because it's an organization built by the status quo, supports the status quo. You know, they have these days. So if it wasn't an issue, then they wouldn't have an international day for it. And you know, we in the Caribbean tend to support every other day. We support Halloween now. We support Thanksgiving, Christmas. You come through the checklist, Earl, we become more celebratory on these things. U.S. Memorial Day, U.S. Independence. But we have this reluctance to support and internalize something that is part of us, regardless of where you sit, because in the Caribbean, we either, whether you're mixed or not, you're either descendants of slaves or descendants of slave owners and plantation owners or descendants of indentured laborers. But there's all some type of history that we are descendants of something from that era and that part, because when the great Christopher Columbus discovered our part of the world, they said that they discovered it and they wiped out the indigenous people that they met here. So let's not understand, let's not fail to understand that what our history is about. And the reality is that the economic and political elite and wealth that built England and mother country was built on the inhumanity, the brutality, the crimes against humanity of slavery.
Mm. Through sport, we've seen several what we would consider atrocities. Um, how do we make amends for some of the things that have gone on and will continue to go on unless we address it?
Well, people have different opinions about that. And as I said, there are people who have an issue with reparation. Um, but to me, it begins with a basic, basic human quality and characteristics.
Mm.
The words, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Mm.
We apologize. That's where it starts. An acknowledgement and a recognition that for 4 centuries, white, the white world, colonialists, the oppressors, have sought to diminish the pain, the reality of colonialism, imperialism, empire, and slavery. They have sought to do that.
Mm. Recently, the president of the IOC said he sees no reason to rewrite history. Why why why
Well,
would he go in that I guess regard as
well,
to not look
well,
back?
this interview here on live in Bermuda, um, we wouldn't be able to unpack, unlearn, and unburden everything in the short time we are allotted. Um, Thomas Bach may be well intentioned. I think he is. He believes a lot in the things he believes in. But like all Europeans, the weight of the atrocities of history is too much for the descendants
Mm.
to bear and acknowledge. And so, when you say you don't want to rewrite history, why is it that the only history they don't want to rewrite is Black history, the history of racialism, racial discrimination, the legacies of that period? Why? They want to rewrite everything else. The IOC wants to rewrite their history, of course, because they want to be seen as the United Nations of sport. That is not how the origins was.
Mm.
The IOC start, they were sexist. Women weren't allowed. Yeah. But you know, let's understand this. In 1661, there was something called the Slave Code. It came out of Barbados at the time, but it was done by the English, the overlords, and then it rolled out, or versions of it rolled out in the Americas, in other parts of the Caribbean. And that slow slave code legitimized, legalized in law that the African slaves were non-human, heathens, and brutes. So, unless, as Marcus Garvey said, you know your history. I'm not saying you know your history to stay locked as a victim in it, or to to look in the rearview mirror. But I believe that once you understand history, you will better be able to understand that as much progress that has been made, and enormous progress has been made, we still have a long way to go, because it goes back to that non-human. Black people were non-human, heathens, brutes, property. Similar in a way, but less brutal than the way they treated women. But you look at the brutality in those days that were perpetuated. And in that context, I've been saying the Commonwealth Games,
Mm-hmm.
the history of the Commonwealth Games goes back to the idea was first broached in 1911. When the first time they had it, it was a festival, competition festival, 1911, to celebrate British Empire and the coronation of King George V. But the idea was first broached in 1891 by Anglican priest John Ashley Cooper, who talked about the idea of using a festival and sports to build goodwill for the British Empire. In other words, to use to use modern day language, sport washing. Sport washing. So we criticize Qatar and we follow all the developed world narrative. But the origins of the Commonwealth Game was to build goodwill and understanding of the British Empire. So that the first games in 1930 was called the British Empire Games.
Mm.
It then evolved to become the British Empire and Commonwealth Games. Then the British Commonwealth Games. And finally in 1978, it was rebranded the Commonwealth Games. So if you don't know your history, you will repeat it.
Mm. Mm.
And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
The committee that you're chairing, what is the basis of what you are trying to accomplish in the early stages?
Well, as the chair of the Gender, Race, Inclusion, Diversity Committee, it's to address the issues of discrimination.
Mhm.
So to sum it up, in the curves of the committee will be non-racism, non-discrimination in all forms and fashion. The overall Sport Integrity Global Alliance deals with a number of issues to deal with safeguarding young youth and young people, trafficking, money laundering in sport,
Mhm.
modern day slavery in sport. There were some atrocities that have taken place over the years in the context of Europe again. There we go. And African footballers, young footballers, and the Americas. So that's what Sport Integrity Global Alliance is about. So they have universal standards that they have come up with
Mhm.
to form best practice. But of course, the IOCs, International Olympic Committee, and a lot of these organizations prefer to self-regulate to protect their autonomy
Mm.
rather than be open to objective, independent scrutiny.
Mm.
So it's about, so if they come back, so they won't be all over the place in the context of, so what I've called for a reparation fund to be established by the Commonwealth Games Federation is to put a first step to show that the Commonwealth, the modern iteration of the Commonwealth Games and the Commonwealth sports movement have acknowledged its beginnings.
Mhm.
And therefore, it's not affinity, it's birth, it's DNA of what it is. And that it is something that, as a Commonwealth sports movement, is now made up of 72 or 71 Commonwealth nations and territories. So, to my friends in sport, the mere fact that we also have territories says that colonialism is still alive.
Mhm.
Yeah? Isn't it? What is
Yeah.
it? An irony, a paradox? So there is no shame in acknowledging, because there is a saying that if you don't acknowledge that, recognize that you have a problem, you can't begin. So you'll continue operating in this la la land, this bubble of everything nice. But it can't be. And you also want to be in the vanguard of change. So I mean, I'm focusing the conversation today on the Commonwealth,
Mhm.
because the Olympic Games was never called the British Empire Olympic Game. The Commonwealth Games was called the British Empire Game. With all, so you can't, they're saying people like you can't cherry pick which part of the British Empire and the Commonwealth you want
Mhm.
to align with, to associate with, and throw away the rest. You know,
Mhm.
um, and when we had bid Trinidad and Tobago, when I was the president, and the then and still current Secretary General Annette Knott, when we went to Birmingham at the time
Mhm.
to bid, you remember we eventually Trinidad and Tobago now won the bid in June 2019. Like Judy Simmons, your Judy Simmons
Yes.
I think she still is on the Commonwealth Games Federation board.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Trinidad and Tobago, Trinbago 2021, as it was called then, which was originally scheduled for 2021, were it not for COVID. Um, we won, there was a view that we weren't a safe pair of hands.
Mhm.
I don't know what that means. And when you consider we were up with no disrespect to them against Gibraltar, it's interesting that we were considered then another safe pair of hands. So part of that bid concept was futuristic, esports, but also part of it and why it was scheduled around then emancipation. Because Trinidad and Tobago is the first country to have, you can Google it if you don't believe me and your listeners, have Emancipation Day as a national public holiday. Yes,
Mhm.
little Trinidad and Tobago from the Caribbean. So it was also to have the Commonwealth Youth Games and the youth 14 to 18 as part of the conversation and dialogue as relates to history. Because I believe that if we want to be transformational, we have to transform away from history, not in spite of history.
Mhm.
And
Well,
as Nelson Mandela said, most powerfully, the iconic Nelson Mandela, who used in 1995 the Rugby World Cup finals to put on a Springbok jersey when the Springboks was the symbol and legacy of apartheid.
mhm.
Yeah. And he used, as he said, the power of sport to unify and make a powerful statement of unification between the majority blacks and the minority whites of South Africa, and therefore set the stage for a non-violent, situation in South Africa. The reality is that as much of those of us in the Commonwealth sports movement may want to deny it, the Commonwealth Games is a symbol and legacy of the British Empire.
I wish we had 3 hours, but I know you have another appointment. Why don't we pick this up again? Because I think lessons need to be learned, voices need to be heard, messages need to be heard as well. And I think, when I contacted you about just having this conversation, I saw the need because I read what you wrote, and it kind of, made me reflect on things of the past, things I knew about but didn't dabble down into it. And I think we need to pick this up again and allow more time to discuss the issues that were in the past that we could avoid with conversation in the future.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. I'm always willing, but remember, it's not about avoiding it. The reality is that systemic sexism, racism will always be there. It is how do you know it? How do you raise awareness? How do you address unconscious bias? And as I also said, let me just slip this one in. A very obvious, but not so obvious legacy of colonialism and slavery is here-based discrimination. You know that there are many people who have had to assimilate to the European standard of what is beauty and what is proper dress and proper hair, not realizing that when the 12 point how much ever million Africans who were enslaved, ripped from their countries, their communities, their families, one of the first things the slave traders did to dehumanize them, to disconnect them from their societies and their families and everything, was to shave their hair, men, women, and children. If you go back to African history, hair was a big thing. A hair signified status, what side you're from, wealth, etc. So that was done. And when the slaves, the plaits, even braiding was a way to send messages of what is the safe route. They would put peas and these in their hair. It was also a method of survival, a method of surviving the oppression. And it's to this day, there are black, white, brown, all types of people who you ask them about natural afros and braids, but they call it cornrow, etc. They will tell you it's inappropriate and unprofessional. Now, women have it a little better now than men. We still live, especially in the Caribbean, where clean cut and clean shaven is the standard by which we hold up what is respectability and being professional. Rastafarian hairstyles, afros, braids, cornrows are still perceived as unprofessional and inappropriate. And that's a legacy of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade.
Sir, thank you very much for your time. Again, I'll reach out to you again and see if we can pick this up again. Okay?
Well, I look forward to it. I'm always accessible and open. And again, best wishes and acknowledgement and celebration of tomorrow, the International Day for the remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And I said best greetings to my colleagues there, both in the Commonwealth and the Olympic sport movement. Peter Dunn, chairman, president, Branwen, Katura, Judy Simmons. Those are the ones I am more familiar with.
And let me just say on their behalf, happy birthday tomorrow.
Thank you very much. I take it wholeheartedly.
All righty. Okay. Enjoy your day.
Thank you very much.